Hey guys, how are you? What I want to do today is I really want to focus on this transition that takes place as we look at the causes of the Revolutionary War as to how loyal British subjects in the colonies um, become the rebels of the American Revolution. And it's an interesting process. You got to remember, and if you go back to our colonial unit, you have to remember that most of the people that came in the 1600s to North America were groups that England didn't mind that much. We're going across the Atlantic. So your Pilgrims, your Quakers, your Catholics in Maryland, the debtors in Georgia, there was a certain amount of good riddance. And England was pretty much fine with the colonists putting their own governmental religious systems together as long as part of that economic system, mercantilism, they were supplying raw goods and resources and also buying British goods. It's kind of a win-win, but you have this 150-year separation that's known historically as salutary neglect, where England's kind of like, hey, you guys do your thing over there and we're fine. Now, what I need you to see, and this is the big shift that takes place, is the French and Indian War. And you look at the map that we have here, and you'll see that you have two European powers that are going at each other all the time in Europe, and they also want their piece of the pie of North America. And so you have England that has settled along the coast here, and then you have the French who are kind of more in the interior, working their way into the Great Lakes, Mississippi River Valley region, and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay. And so there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict. And the French and Indian War is about a 9-year conflict that takes place. And eventually Britain comes out ahead in that war. Well, after 150 years, remember Jamestown, 1607, the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, 1620. So you're going about 150 plus years. What the British realize, and this is true, the average American colonist is living better than Britain. Britain has spent a lot of money in the French and Indian War. Wars are expensive, and they realize, hey, um, we can start taxing the colonists. Okay, and they do. And so what I want you to see is there's a very French and Indian War. Right after the French and Indian War, there is a very quick, I mean, rapid uptake of British enforcing their laws and the British really ratcheting up the number of taxes that they have with on the American colonists. I mean, it becomes very, very quick that this takes place. And so, and you can almost, I mean, you can timeline this. I mean, almost immediately, the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War was in 1763. And King George almost immediately starts to place rules on the colonists and rules that haven't been placed on them in hundreds of years. I mean, 5 generations have lived in the colonies. And I don't want to make it seem like completely without British rule, but with quite a bit of autonomy. And the first thing that King George does is he creates what's called the Proclamation of 1763, which forbids the colonists from moving westward. Well, during this time period, land is wealth. You know, we've talked about this tobacco, some of those cash crops. A lot of these crops need land, and the average person wants that opportunity. And so the colonists just don't sit back. You know, they want this land. They want to move west, and they consistently ignore the Proclamation of 1763. Timeline wise, what I want you to see is almost immediately, boom, French and Indian War is over. Treaty of Paris that ends the French and Indian War is in 1763. Boom, England starts locking down. All right. And they want to pay for this huge war debt that they have. They want to pay for this big military. They want to pay for some of the financial situations that they have. And the colonists are wealthy. There's all kinds of raw goods and resources. So they want to tax those sources. And then note how quickly all this is happening. Sugar Act, 1764. British policy designed to raise more income from the colonies. You pay a tax on sugar. You buy British sugar, you pay a tax on it. Something that people use every day then and now. You're paying a hefty tax to raise raise money for the government in Britain. Now, this one would be tough. I'm a loyal citizen, always have been. Oftentimes in history, I always think, okay, where would I place myself? And I would guess, knowing me, that if my dad was a British citizen, then by gosh, I'm going to be a British citizen. But the Quartering Act of 1765 has got to be tough. As a way of saving money for British troops in the colony, basically, and I'm painting in really broad strokes here, but the British could request to use your home. It was your responsibility as a citizen of England, even though you're a colonist, to house British troops. And, they usually took the good stuff. If you're a captain something something of the British Army, boy, that master bedroom of that big plantation house looks pretty good today. Hey, you guys have all this livestock. Make sure my troops get fed. And that would be tough. I'm a huge supporter of the military, but if a platoon comes knocking on my door this afternoon, wants to use the swimming pool and have me barbecue, maybe one afternoon, that'd be great. But boy, if you're moving in, that's going to get tough. Later, I want you to see, by the way, this is where the Third Amendment to the United States Constitution comes from. It's always the Third Amendment's the one that's like, what the heck? Well, the Third Amendment, which says no quartering of troops, comes directly from the Quartering Act of 1765. Notice we're still in 1765. You have the Stamp Act, and it places a tax on all paper products and legal documents. And this is weird for us, but that's how business was done. If you were going to do business in 1765, you had to get this stamp, and you had to pay a tax to get this stamp to do business. And this is a straight up revenue tax. The only reason Britain is doing this is to tax the Americans more. So this is not, this isn't most taxes, the tax that you and I pay on a daily basis, you can argue, hey, I pay this tax, I get some kind of service for it. This is just one for the British going, hey, we're doing this. Well, why are you doing this? We need more money and we want you to pay. Which leads to, and I want you to see with the Stamp Act, you start to have a back and forth that happens. And you have what's the Stamp Act uproar. This is one of the first times where American citizens start the process of going, and I should say British citizens that live in the colonies, now they felt like our rights are being infringed on. Okay, so they start to ignore these things. They start to ignore the admiralty courts of the British. Okay, and it's also the beginnings of that concept that becomes one of the cornerstones of the American Revolution. No taxation. Don't tax us if you're not going to give us representation. The American colonists weren't complaining about taxes. I think they understood that. Well, everybody complains about taxes, but I think they understood the necessity of taxes. Their concern is, hey, wait a minute. If you're taxing me, shouldn't I have say in that process? You and I, if we get taxed, via voting and our members of Congress and stuff like that, we have voice. All right. And what you have is the colonies create this thing called the Stamp Act Congress. And delegates from across the colonies get together to start the process to protest against the Stamp Act Congress. So I want you to see there's this back and forth. French and Indian War, Britain starts to lock down. The first thing that we respond to as colonists is the Stamp Act. And then we have what's called the Stamp Act Congress. I did want you guys to see that piece. And eventually as all this is going on, and something that you guys are well aware of, because of these different taxes and stuff, it's kind of tough on the colonial economy. And so you start to see some protests. And one of the times in 1770, you have the Boston Massacre. And you had a group of basically out of work dock workers who would go, I think they'd go to the pub, truthfully. And then when they were done at the pub and they ran out of money, they would go harass British soldiers that were outside the custom house in downtown Boston. And in the midst of harassing these guys, they're throwing snowballs. There was a late snow that year in March, throwing snowballs. Some guys put some rocks and snowballs. You see where this is going. British troops, which were outnumbered, there were probably 300 plus protesters, handful of British troops. they get spooked, somebody fires into the crowd. But what I want you to see, though, whatever happened, and you guys can kind of read around and see, there's a lot of speculation. I think I'll be honest with you, quite a bit of the issues of the Boston Massacre probably fall on the colonial protesters. But at the end of the day, you've got 5 non-military civilians that are dead in the streets. Um, and so this is going to ramp up protests. It's going to make people more angry. You know, you also start to get in this back and forth that we're talking about. We have another group that's created called the Committees of Correspondence, where different leaders from the colonies start to reach out to each other. Hey, what's going on in your colony? What's going on in this colony? What should we do? Hey, what did you guys do about this? And you're starting to see more communication. And as a way of protesting against the British Tea Acts, which basically gave British companies a monopoly over tea, which is a huge product of the time period, you have the Boston Tea Party. And so you start to have a ramping up of this is another example of protest. Okay. And by the way, there were tea parties. I think it's lost. The Boston Tea Party wasn't the only one. From, going from the Carolinas up to Massachusetts, there were multiple tea parties where, as a protest, people went to British ships and dumped British tea into the harbor as kind of an economic boycott. Now, things get really interesting here. So you get into now we're at 1774, and we have a thing called the First Continental Congress. And just to put that into perspective, in many ways, the First Continental Congress is the first government, or at least the beginnings of government in the United States. And you have 56 delegates, and you have people from each colony. Now, Georgia's tough. To be honest with you, one, Georgia, way down south there, is pretty far away from Philadelphia and the larger cities. The other thing about Georgia became a colony in the 1730s, so Georgia still has pretty strong ties to England. It's a relatively new colony, but the Continental Congress comes together as a protest against the British Intolerable Acts. And they start to, and this is by the way, if you're ever going to protest, this is how you boycott. Most successful nonviolent protest is boycott. If you want to win, hit somebody hit them in the wallet, hit them in the pocketbook. And so they agree, the Continental Congress agrees to start to boycott English goods. Remember, the whole system, the colonial system's based on, hey, America's going to give us raw goods, and then we're going to make goods, and the Americans in the colonies are going to buy those goods. Well, if you start buying, or excuse me, you quit buying British products, that's going to create a problem in the economy. The other thing about the Continental Army where things get really interesting is you start to have colonial citizens start to arm themselves and form these militias. They're not going to war, but you're kind of practicing for war. You're kind of flexing up a little bit towards the British government, which is, if you really think about it, it's kind of crazy. Britain had the best military in the world, best land troops, not the biggest military in the world, but the best trained land troops in the world, and the biggest and the best navy in the world. And the Intolerable Acts were just, and that's obviously a colonial name, what they're protesting against. And this is laws that, they did this in response to the Parliament of Britain did this in response to the Boston Tea Party and the other tea parties. So Boston Harbor's closed. Well, Boston was one of the busiest ports, not just in the Americas, but in the world. So that puts a lot of people out of work. Got to remember, Massachusetts has been ruling itself for 150 years. They have all their own court system and things like that. Those get shut down. Town hall meetings, which are embedded into the culture of New England, they're put out there. If British soldiers got into an altercation, they wouldn't be tried in the colonies. They would be sent back to England. There's a lot going on here, and that's why they're called in the colonies the Intolerable Acts. And then you get to a point of what's called the shot heard around the world. I mean, we get to, by 1775, They're shooting between the British and these militias that are set up by the Continental Congress. And so you do have a transition. So remember, 1763, French and Indian War, wars are expensive. And then what I want you to see, British tax or policy, and then usually some kind of colonial response. And eventually that works its way to the British military in Boston's like, we're not going to let these, and this makes sense. We're not going to let these militias train. We're not going to let these people practice how best to kill us. We're not going to let them arm themselves. And so they march out to the countryside to start breaking up these militias and get their weapons. There's a little shootout. I'll be honest with you. The colonists kind of fire one shot, they get the heck out of there. But what ends up happening is the British find very few weapons. Further, when the British troops start to march back from Boston in a very militia style format, the Americans start sniping them in the back, and the British actually have a pretty difficult time getting back to Boston. It also sets a tone for what the Revolutionary War is. But so 1763 into the French and Indian War. By 1775, the British military and British officials and the American colonists are shooting at each other. Now there's this weird period from 1775. So we're at April 1775. It's not until July of 1776. So there's this weird 15-month time period where um, we're in this pseudo war with the British. We haven't declared our independence. We're actually trying to reel this back in a little bit. But I want you to see how we move royal citizens, you know, colonists to rebels and the process of how that happens. Okay. And then you get to Lexington and Concord. So I hope that helps you with the process. I hope that clarifies some things. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions. All right. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.